Hello guys, welcome. So I'll be explaining an important concept of bundle branch block in this video, which includes your left bundle branch block as well as your right bundle branch block. So before I explain the pathophysiology of bundle branch blocks, I'll be explaining about the basic physiology of conduction system of the heart. So conduction system of the heart includes your sinoatrial node. Okay, the sinoatrial node is located in the right atrium near the opening of SVC, superior vena cava, right? So this sinoatrial node is called as a pacemaker of the heart. Pacemaker of the heart. Okay, so this sinoatrial node is responsible for the generation of impulses in the heart. And once these impulses are generated in sinoatrial node, it travels through various tracts like tract of Bachmann, tract of Toral, tract of Wenckebach, and various other pathways to reach a structure called as your AV node. Okay, atrioventricular node. So this atrioventricular node is located in the base of interatrial septum. So once the impulses reach the atrioventricular node, there's a slight delay in conduction of impulses. This is called as your AV nodal delay, which I'll be explaining in other videos. AV nodal delay. So once it reaches atrioventricular node, there's an AV nodal delay, and once the delay is over, the impulses are carried forward to bundle of His. Okay, bundle of His. Then finally, this bundle of His divides into left bundle branch and right bundle branch. So the impulses basically travel through these bundle branches, which again further divides into Purkinje fibers, and finally the impulses reach the ventricular myocardium. So I'll summarize the entire conduction system. So first thing is there's something called as the sinoatrial node, which is located in the right atrium near the opening of SVC, right? It's called as the pacemaker of heart and is responsible for generation of all the impulses, right? So once the impulse is generated in the sinoatrial node, it travels through various tracts such as Toral, Bachmann, Wenckebach, and finally reaches a structure called as atrioventricular node, also called as AV node. So this is located in the base of interatrial septum, right? So once these impulses reach the AV node, there's a physiological delay which happens. It's also called as the AV nodal delay. Once the delay is over, the impulses are carried forward through bundle of His, which again divides into left bundle branch as well as right bundle branch, and then the impulses are carried forward, and finally it divides into Purkinje fibers and is responsible for the the impulses reaching the ventricular myocardium. So having understood the basic physiology of conduction system of heart, we'll move on to phases of ventricular depolarization. Okay. Before that, we'll learn a rule, very important rule to understand the basic concept of any form of ECG. Okay. So it says that if there's any wave of depolarization towards a particular lead, okay, there's always a positive deflection. It's a basic rule. Let us understand it. If, for example, there is a lead V1, okay, there's a lead V1, and the current of depolarization is traveling towards the particular lead, then you always get a positive wave in ECG, right? That's the main thing. If, for example, the current of depolarization is moving away from the lead, then you get a negative wave in ECG. That's the main concept. So I'll reinforce it. Wave of depolarization traveling towards that particular lead, it always produces a positive reflection. Away from the lead, it produces a negative deflection. That's the basic concept. Now moving on to phases of ventricular depolarization. So it occurs in two phases. First part is the septum gets depolarized, and then following which you get the main ventricular myocardium to get depolarized. So what happens in septal depolarization is, so direction is towards the left to right as represented in the diagram. So depolarization of the septum takes place from the left towards the right, okay, as shown in the diagram. So what exactly happens is, since the current of depolarization is towards lead V1, so you get a positive wave, okay, you get a positive wave. So we'll name this wave as septal R wave, okay. And since the current of depolarization is basically away from lead V6, it's going away from lead 6, you get a negative wave. We'll name it as septal Q wave. So this is what happens exactly during first phase of depolarization. So let me repeat the basic rule. Basic rule is, when the current of depolarization is towards one particular lead, you get a positive wave. If it is away from the lead, you get a negative wave. Okay. So what is exactly happening in ventricular depolarization is, first the septum gets depolarized in the direction of left to right. Since the current of depolarization is going towards the V1, you get a positive wave, right? This positive wave is called a septal R wave, since the septum is getting depolarized. And since the current of depolarization is away from the V6 lead, you get a negative wave called as septal Q wave, okay? So this is what exactly happens in the first phase of ventricular depolarization. Now, once the septum gets depolarized, now the myocardium has to be depolarized, right? So what happens is there is simultaneous activation of or depolarization of both the left ventricle as well as right ventricle. But what is the direction of depolarization? Since the left ventricle appears to be a more thicker as well as it has more vector compared to that of right ventricle. It's more thicker, hence more amount of current goes to the left ventricle. So hence the direction of depolarization of the ventricular myocardium is towards the left side. So from right to left, right? So in septal depolarization, it was left to right. Whereas when the ventricular myocardium gets depolarized, the total vector, the total direction is towards from right to left, right? So since the current of depolarization is facing away from V1, you get a negative wave. So first we got an septal R wave, and since the current of depolarization is towards the left or away from lead V1, you get an S wave, right? So you got an R wave and then you got an S wave. That's the thing. And since the direction of depolarization is towards lead V6, so after a first initial negative wave, which we got a septal Q wave, you get a positive wave of R wave, okay? So that's the basic physiology of ventricular depolarization. Let me summarize it again. So ventricular depolarization includes septal depolarization and then finally the main myocardium getting depolarized. Septal depolarization takes place in the direction of left to right. And since it is traveling towards V1, since the current of depolarization is traveling towards V1, you get a positive wave. This positive wave is called a septal R wave, right? So any QRS complex consists of negative wave called as Q wave, a positive wave called as R wave, and a negative wave again called as S wave. And since it's a positive wave, we name it as septal R wave, okay? And since the current of depolarization is traveling towards away from V6, you get a negative wave called as septal Q wave, okay? So once the septum is depolarized, we'll move on to the myocardium. So both the left ventricle as well as right ventricle gets depolarized. But since the mass of left ventricle is higher compared to right ventricle, so what happens is the total direction or the total vector direction is towards the left. And since it is away from V1, you get a negative wave called as S wave here. And since it is towards V6, you get a positive wave called as R wave here, okay? So in lead V1, so you get an QRS complex like this, R wave and S wave. Whereas in V6, you get a first negative wave, Q wave, and then you get an R wave, okay? So that's the basic physiology of ventricular depolarization. So after understanding this concept of ventricular depolarization, we'll move on to right bundle branch block. So here the main issue is the right bundle branch, okay? That is getting affected due to variety of reasons, organic, any pathology or something like that. So mainly right bundle branch is affected. So as we know, ventricular depolarization has two phases. One, the septum gets depolarized first, followed by ventricular myocardium. So in Rbbb, what happens is the septal depolarization is normal, it's not affected. So since the current of depolarization is towards the V1, you get an septal R wave, and since it is away from V6, you get a septal Q wave. So this first part of or first phase of depolarization is not affected in Rbbb. Now coming to second phase. So what exactly happens is, since there is an issue with your right bundle, okay, since there is an issue with right bundle, it's not proper or due to any organic cause, so the left ventricular depolarization takes place. Since the current of depolarization is towards V6, so after an initial negative deflection, you get a positive deflection. So this is septal Q wave, which we learned. Now you get an R wave here, okay? And since the current of depolarization is away, it's away from, V1, after a positive wave, you get a negative wave. So this is your septal R wave and this is your septal S wave, okay? This is also fine. But since the right ventricle is not depolarized in the second phase, you again have a third phase in Rbbb. So after your left ventricle is completely depolarized, finally the right ventricle gets depolarized, okay? So your wave still now happens to be, So first positive wave, which happens to be R wave, and then your negative wave called as S wave. Here you get an septal Q wave and then an R wave, right? Till the second phase. Now in third phase, after the left ventricle is completely depolarized, finally the right ventricle gets depolarized. And since the vector is towards the V1, you get a positive wave here. Okay, we'll call this as R dash. Right, understood, right? So finally when the right ventricle is getting depolarized in the third phase of ventricular depolarization, and since it is towards V1, you get a positive R dash wave. Okay, and then since it is away from V6, you get a negative wave here. That's it, you get a negative wave, right? So somewhat looks like M pattern, somewhat looks like W, right? So this is your Rbbb pathology. So if we take a look at an ECG, in V1 you get an initial septal R wave, and then you get a negative S wave, and then you get an R dash wave. Okay, so it's something like this. This is your M pattern. This resembles a rabbit's ears, hence it's called as rabbit ear pattern. Okay, so this is what happens in V1. Now coming to V6, so you have an initial negative Q wave here, okay, septal Q wave here, and then you get a positive R wave here, and then finally a negative S wave here. Okay, so you get something called as W pattern. Okay, so this is seen in V6. So this is all about your Rbbb pattern. Let me repeat it again. So ventricular depolarization has two phases. First one, the septum gets depolarized, and finally the ventricular myocardium. In Rbbb, septal depolarization is not affected. So hence the depolarization vector is towards V1. So you get a positive wave, and this positive wave is called as an R wave, septal R wave. Okay, nothing is affected here, and since the wave is away from V6, you get a septal Q wave. Okay, very simple thing. So first phase of ventricular depolarization is not affected in Rbbb. Now moving on to second phase. This is when the actual pathology starts. Since the right bundle branch is blocked, so the left ventricle gets depolarized, and since the direction of depolarization is towards V6, you get a positive wave here called as R wave here, and then since it's away from V1, you get a negative wave here called as S wave. Okay, and now after the left ventricle is depolarized, your right ventricle is remaining, right? So hence finally the impulses travel, and finally the right ventricle gets depolarized, and since the direction of depolarization is towards V1, after a negative wave we get a positive wave again, and here you get a negative wave because it's away from V6, right? So this resembles a rabbit ear pattern, or also called as M pattern. Okay, RSR complex, M pattern, also called as a rabbit ear pattern. If we look at an ECG, you get a positive R wave called a septal wave, and then you get a negative S wave, and then again you get an R dash wave. Okay, so this is called as your Rbbb pattern. When we look at V6, you get a negative Q wave, and then you get a positive R wave, and then finally you get an S wave, W pattern, right? So this is your thing, M as well as W. So this is all about your Rbbb.